This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review. Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought, and to debate, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic, and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm Dahlia Shenlin.
And I'm Gilad Halpern. Every week we'll be talking about books and research and other things that have caught our attention. Our guest today is Dr. Martina Weisz. She's a research fellow at the Hebrew University's Vidal Sassoon International Center for the Study of Anti-Semitism. We'll be talking today about her research on Jews, Latin America, and the global structure of colonialism. It featured in a roundtable discussion at the Van Leer Institute that was dedicated to racism and anti-Semitism in Latin America. Martina Weisz, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hello, thank you for inviting me.
So I think that perhaps the main question that arises from your research is, were Jews of the Spanish colonies among the privileged or the oppressed? It's clear they came with the colonizers and not part of the colonized populations. But what was really their general position within that?
Well, that's the whole thing I'm trying to decipher now. And I'm on the first stages of the research. It's not, I'm just trying to find out what is the specific function that anti-Semitism fulfilled in what Aníbal Quijano calls the coloniality of power. And of course, the place of the Jew is a place which is ambivalent in many cases. First of all, for the whole idea of race as racism, what happened in the Iberian Peninsula before the discovery and the conquest of the American continent was key. And that was the expulsion of the Jews in the very same year where the American continent was discovered, so-called discovered.
1492, in case any of our listeners forgot.
Yeah, 1492, right? What would later become the Spaniards also conquered Granada, which was the last stronghold of the Muslims. So their whole world was shaped by this idea of an other, which was also the so-called Moor, of course, a negative connotation, the Moors and the Jews. With these ideas in mind, they came to America, and when they saw the Indians, the idea of another was a religious other. Which is interesting is that already about 50 years before the arrival of the Spaniards to the American continent, began a process by which theological categories of otherness, like Jews and Muslims, non-believers, people who do not believe in Jesus, were kind of racialized. They become, through the blood purity statutes, they become slowly the descendants of those who had already converted to Christianity, begins to be limited. It's like they couldn't access certain, like the clergy or the military. It was a very slow process. So we can see it's not me, it's scholars like David Nirenberg and Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi, they speak of this process of racialization of the difference.
But how different is that from what happened during the Inquisition? I mean, isn't that just an outgrowth of the obvious otherization, if you want to call it that was going on during the great persecution of the Jews during earlier times?
It's exactly part of that. It's exactly part of that. This whole process that there is another which is also inside. I mean, the former order, which is the Jew and the Muslim, slowly became, since they became Christians, it was a kind of assimilation.
So it was because they had sort of
avant la
assimilated.
lettre. And that's why Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi, he makes a parallel what happened in Germany, for instance, where the assimilation of the Jews, when they came out of the ghetto and they became the secularization, they become like everyone else. Then they started to think in otherness in terms of racial terms. And this process, a similar one, of course, we are talking of a big difference in terms of time differences, but Yerushalmi already makes this parallel on other scholars. We can see a process of racialization. Which is interesting is that the whole establishment of racial categories in the colonies after the conquest of the American continent has been influenced by this othering of the Jew and of the Muslim.
The interesting thing here, I think, is that it's really a dual process in the sense that on the one hand, we have, almost like an extension of like the medieval social order, like medieval spirit of, this a very religious, as you said, a very Catholic, very Christian view on the world. And on the other hand, we have like the very first buds of modernity in the sense of, the racialization and the social categorization of the different populations. Was Spain and the Iberian Peninsula unique in that? I mean, I believe that the colonial experiences in other places in Europe were slightly different.
Well, I'm not really an expert on what happened, for instance, in England or in other parts. According to Quijano, which I'm quoting, and he's the one who coined...
sociologist.
He's a Peruvian sociologist who coined the term coloniality of power. And of course, he's Peruvian, and what he argues is that the social categories, the association of race as racism with different hierarchies and related to labor, also, of course, he's a neo-Marxist, so he uses always economics, but the correlations between race on different types of labor, for instance, like he argues that only the whites actually worked for a wage, as the Indians were serfs and the blacks were slaves. So there was a correlation in the form of the distribution of world labor, which was associated with race. And what he argues, and I think to some extent it is very interesting because you can see how it works in today's world. To some extent, despite the fact that actually the colonial word and colonialism doesn't really exist anymore, but these structures, racism dies hard, and this kind of what he calls the structures, the coloniality of power, is still very influential today. And we see in the different working conditions of people in Africa, in Asia, and in Europe, on all the immigration issues and Latino issues in the States. So I think it's an interesting analysis, the one he makes.
So I want to talk about that bridge to modernity and how these processes are still with us. But just to go back for a moment, because you said that the emerging treatment of the Jews who had converted already to Christianity was what sort of began, or when these processes of racializing within the society, emerged or evolved and then were sort of imported into the colonial thinking. It makes it sound like they were almost practicing for the future colonial racial categories among the Jews in their midst who were conversos. Would you call
maybe
it that?
I guess they didn't know that.
Maybe not consciously, right?
Not consciously.
No, but was it intuitive to them to develop these kinds of systems in the colonial environment because they were already emerging and part of the emerging way of life?
Maybe. What I can say for sure is that the processes after the conquest of the American continent developed in parallel ways. That I can tell you for sure, because chronologically they developed like the whole thing of the Inquisition on the blood purity statutes. It was at the same time that the racial categories were being established on the American continent. So that definitely happened in about the same time. With the beginning, the whole racialization, it started before with the Jews and the Muslims, but it got stronger as the whole colonial system was being developed.
Well, this makes me think that I would love for you to tell us the story of what happens to a Jew who is from a converted family from Spain, who comes to one of the Spanish Portuguese colonies in which country? I can't remember, but you write about Manuel Bautista Perez. Mm-hmm. So what is the situation of this person who is part of the colonial society, but is in the position of the Jew?
Well, that's what I was trying. I know it's problematic, but it's just one example as to, of course, officially, the Jews were forbidden to enter like the colonies. There were no Jews, no external Jews, no visible Jews. And the convertos were very limited as well, the conversos. But many of them worked in the trades and were merchants. And Manuel Bautista Perez was a very rich merchant. He was a Spaniard. He was the son of Portuguese conversos. And he became a very influential and a very rich person and very respected. And he was the leader of the very powerful converso community in Lima, today's Peru. And at that point, as a researcher of anti-Semitism, I see that an important, I don't know if it's a turning point, but something is starting to get shape. It's the whole idea that the Jews, the conspiracy theories associated to the Jews, which is something which is very powerful nowadays. You can see it on the left, on the right. And already here you can start seeing it in practice, because this person was burned at the stake, accused of being a conspirator together with other 9 people. They called it Conspiración Grande, the Great Conspiration, on this whole idea that the Jews, he wasn't even a Jew, he was a Christian.
Yeah.
And that's the whole thing about racial. He wasn't a Jew, he was a converso, he was a practicing Catholic. He said, I'm a Catholic, I believe in Jesus. I mean, he never accepted this accusation.
And
of
what century
Judaizing.
are we talking about?
17th century. The middle of the 17th century. And he was burned to the stake because these conversos were and they were still being called Jews. And that's interesting as well. I mean, they were not Jews, but...
When his families were converted from the 15th century.
Exactly. I mean, a generation before. It was Portugal, the last
Okay,
bit.
Right.
okay.
Mm-hmm.
So, and this whole idea that the Jews conspire both with the enemy within and the enemy, this was the competitors, the Dutch, is starting to get strong there. Although we can see already some time before, we have some precedents in Spain of what some scholars consider is a precedent of the protocols of the Elders of Zion. We can already see by the mid-16th century, for instance, las cartas de los judíos de Constantinopla, the letters from the Jews from Constantinople. No one really knows when it was written and who wrote this, but what they know is that the whole idea of conspiration, according to the letters, the Jews in Constantinople, what should they do? Should they leave Spain or should they convert? And their brothers in religion tells them, okay, you are welcome here in Constantinople, but we suggest you to try to convert and to get very high to get very powerful, to become good doctors, good economists, to become powerful people in the Christian society, and from within try to destroy it. So we can see, and I believe that the interesting part is that it is part of this empire building. That's what I'm trying to research. To which extent this is part of this idea of becoming a global power. Which function does the Jew feel in there? Because it's a relatively new phenomenon associated to empire building.
Now, the interesting thing here is that, even though they tried really hard to eradicate Jewish presence from the public sphere, as early as you say, the mid-16th century, we already see, those notions of with a perennial Jew creeping, around, making all sorts of conspiracies, still very much present. And this is also, you mentioned imperialism, and I want to take it one step forward, perhaps, and tie it back to Quijano, who, as you said, is, his analysis is neo-Marxist. To what extent is it really tied with capitalism? Because this is really the, golden age of capitalism, early imperialism, this new world being just thrown open for the European powers to gobble up. These issues, these ideas of racial, all this... Sorry,
according to Quijano, this construction of the race as racism and the need to establish racial categories that allow for an exploitation of other people. Actually, they were trying to legitimize the exploitation of the enslavement of the people from Africa and working to death of the Aboriginal people. So they were trying to legitimize domination. What's interesting here is that in the case of the Jew, on the one hand, they were privileged people as kind of whites because they were discriminated, but they were allowed.
They were the bad whites.
They were the bad whites. That's exactly what I think.
Tell us what the phrase was.
La mala raza blanca, the bad white race. And of course, Jews weren't really considered as white. Very often until the middle of the 20th century. We can see that. But this expression somehow is interesting to me because it allows me to see this ambivalence. On the one hand, they were whites. They were, again, like this person that was burned to the stake, this Manuel Pérez.
And let's remind our listeners that Manuel Pérez, as you point out, became extremely wealthy largely by being a slave trader.
Yes.
He was part of the colonial
with the Jesuits. It's right. The order that belongs to the current pope.
Basically, nobody comes out of this looking good.
The current pope is actually a Jesuit, just to keep it in mind. I mean, yes, with the Catholics. So he was considered like he was bringing service to the crown and to the clergy, to the church. He felt like he was a good Christian. Again, it's hard to...
Wait, let me get this straight.
Yeah.
He thought he was a good Christian by trading slaves for the church, but the church saw him as a bad Christian and a Jew. I mean,
well,
it's
that's the problem about
mind-boggling.
being a Jew. And that's why I think this example is so good. Because nowadays, many people and many Jews might feel, well, we're not being discriminated against. And that's true to some extent. Of course, we are privileged as whites. But there is something there, which is a kind of difference that can be considered as racial, that has racial elements, but it's different from being like having a black skin. And that's the whole thing with anti-Semitism, on anti-Jews kinds of perceptions. That's why it's so difficult to handle. And in this case, it reminds me of so many Jews I know who feel powerful. Okay, we are done. And yet, there is something there which is still problematic. Some ideas of conspiration, some ideas about being ontologically bad at something, some kind of suspicions, which need to be addressed. Of course, it's not the same. No one is going to burn you at the stake. And we are a completely different period. There are many differences. But it's still there something that needs to be considered and taken into consideration.
Can I ask you a question about going back a few minutes about those letters from Constantinople? Can we go back to that middle part? Were they genuine? Were they authentic? I mean, was this genuinely advice that the Constantinople Jews gave to their brethren?
I don't think
saying,
so. No one really knows. I don't think so. I think it's a fake.
So it is more like the protocols.
It's very much. It's very much. So again, it's interesting.
And of course, it's no coincidence that they came from Constantinople. I mean, the representatives of a foreign hostile power.
Exactly, you're right, absolutely right. Maybe I'm coming back to this idea. Well, you asked me this question about the other empires, and there is something here which I want to say as a South American, which is very interesting, about the Black legend.
Tell us what it is first.
During the 16th century, the imperial competition between England and Spain became to be strong. And then the whole idea that the Spaniards were very brutal in the colonies, and they were associated to the Moors. This idea of brutality was associated to the Moors, of course, inverted commas. It's a negative term. That they were not good enough, but our empire is it's a good one. We are here now. The burden of the white man's burden. So this whole idea that the Spaniards and the Latino, the Iberians are kind of an inferior race. It's a kind of a mild form of racism.
Basically, it was English propaganda, wasn't it?
Of course, yes. And of course, because as they said, some scholars say that they trafficked with slaves. That wasn't a problem for them. But the treatment of the Indians was a problem for them. So it was kind of very hypocritical. But the whole idea that the Spaniards, on the Inquisition, this whole idea of the black, the Inquisition and things, which of course were true. The problem is that sometimes it's used to legitimize their own imperial colonies. And that's the problematic part of it.
So do you think that the Spanish got bad rep for their colonial practices more than they should have done? I mean, compared to the
not
to
necessarily.
The English and
one gets a D-, one gets an F.
No, I'm not a big fan of Spanish colonialism either. They were right, but it's just that they weren't better. That's the point.
Yeah.
You have a lot of research also about modern, Jews and anti-Semitism in modern Spain. How do you think some of these racial ideas and otherness categories that were maybe started following the Inquisition with the treatment of the conversos, leading into colonialism, and then reflecting back into modern Spain? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, well, I was in Spain a few days ago for a seminar on anti-Semitism. And one of the characteristics of today's anti-Semitism in Spain is the idea of conspiration. It's so powerful. And you can look in the bookstores, like you find easily people who
Jewish conspiracy theories or any general conspiracy theories?
Well, usually there is a Jewish element. Now I will even say an Israeli element implied, but then you have all kinds of mixed. Like I read someone who argued that actually also already in the Middle Ages they were Zionists. Like they mixed up everything, every single thing.
Well, the Zionists would agree. They would say we've existed for thousands of years.
Interesting. But you can mix everything. They do have a history. During Franco times, there was an official propaganda calling for the contubernio judeo-masónico izquierdista, the kind of association between Jews on Freemasons, on leftists. And that was official propaganda during the Franco regime. But today it expanded to all kinds. It really, beyond the limits of the imaginable. Everything is possible. There always is a Jew, because the Jew, and that's another characteristic of the place of the Jews in these constructions of otherness. The Jew is also powerful. Is somehow, on the one hand, is feared of. There's something to be careful about. On the other hand, in Spain, you can see it very clearly. There is some admiration for the Jews, a very high admiration. And you can even see it in encyclopedias and dictionaries. Like they say it's the highest ideal because of the chosen people. They have this very strong. So this,
and perhaps a complementary question is, what is really the state of the post-colonial discourse in Spain today? I mean, how do they perceive the colonial past? And again, in my head, I'm comparing it to other European powers who have really this troubled legacy of colonialism.
They have a hard time because on the one hand, they are very proud of it because that makes them belong to Europe. And they were an empire and they were powerful. And an interesting point is that after the return of democracy in 1975, when dictator Franco died and there was the transition to democracy, the Spanish Cortes, the parliament, established the National Day on the 12th of October, which is the day of this so-called discovery of the American continent. That means that their national identity is based on the conquest of another continent, which is not theirs anymore. But it is there, and which is also interesting is that even the socialists agreed to that. Not only, like we could say, the fascists or the phalangists, but also the socialists and stuff. So, of course, some people, I say, well, this is problematic. And another interesting point is that very often, for many years, the Spanish government has been financing cultural events and education events related to, for instance, the recuperation of the languages, almost extinguished languages from the Aborigines and stuff, trying to recover...
In South America.
In South America, the pre-Columbian past, before the colonies. On the other hand, they just celebrate the conquest with the biggest day, it's the big national day. So there's a problem there.
I have to say that it reminds me a lot of how colonialism is perceived in today's France. So perhaps Spain is not that different. I don't know.
I believe there is some kind of continuity between... And I think, I didn't finish actually, I'm coming back to this idea of the black legend. It's interesting because it's related to this. It's interesting to see how very often we forget Spain when we speak of history, even of modernity, of the big events of history. We forget Spain. And I think it's related to some extent to this idea that Spain, okay, there's a saying in France, Europe begins in the Pyrenees. And as well as I don't know much about Africa. You probably won't know much about Africa if you are born in Europe or in South America because we don't study that. And Spain was kind of considered like backwards and maybe not important enough.
The black
legend.
Yes. So I think it's part of it. It's related to some extent to the black legend. Because when you think of the promise of the Republican, we had some discussions about discussing French colonialism in Northern Africa, for instance, on the different relations to Jews and Muslims. We can see some parallelisms with colonial Spain. This idea of a Christianity, of expanding Christianity as a community of people who are equal before God, and equal in rights, and everyone has a soul and shall be respected, and we all have rights. These ideas, they resonate, of course, in a secularized ways, in many of the Republican ideas. And both of them led to colonialism during the Renaissance, and colonialism much later during the 19th and even 20th century.
Very interesting. Thank you. That's Dr. Martina Weisz talking about Jews, Latin America, and the global structure of colonialism. Thank you for being on the show.
Thank you for inviting me.
And also a big thanks to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, and to Itai Shelem, our producer, and to the Van Leer Institute for their generous support. We would also like to thank Peter Frey and Carrie Shapiro and the Romay Foundation, who made a generous contribution to the Tel Aviv Review. Or I should say very generous, actually. We also have a great opportunity for you to help us. Also, you can go to our website, tlv1.fm/podcast/Tel Aviv Review Show, and donate to our Patreon campaign. You'll be part of our quest for learning and knowledge, and you'll get gifts like bonus segments, book discounts, and many fascinating things. Thank you to those who are already supporting us. In the meantime, also, please check out our archives. There are over 400 interviews to keep you busy. Like us on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast Ideas from Israel. Follow both me and Gilad on Twitter. And join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.